Hey everybody, and thank you for being here for another presentation as part of the Southeast Greenways and Trails Summit, our virtual summit. We really appreciate your patience as we transitioned into a virtual format, so thank you for being here. My name is Sarah Sanford. I'm with the East Coast Greenway Alliance, and I will introduce myself a bit more in just a minute. First, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of the sponsors for the Southeast Greenways and Trails Summit, especially to those who are speaking today. We do have a few folks on this list who are some of our featured speakers, so thank you for being here. So I will be presenting today. My presentation is called Using Greenways to Combat Climate Change. And this is a presentation I actually have given before. The last time was at the North Carolina Bike Walk Summit. So the case studies in this presentation are really focused on North Carolina, but the lessons learned, the best practices, all the big picture stuff, that's applicable for greenways anywhere throughout the United States. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start off the presentation with a few photos from different parts of North Carolina over the course of about the last year or two. So this first one is a beach in the Outer Banks back in October of 2019. This one is US 421 at the Pender County, New Hanover County line, also from last year in 2019. And this is in Catawba County in June of 2019. And I have a couple headlines I want to look at as well. Triple-digit heat shatters October temperature records in southern United States. Thursday brings record temperatures to central North Carolina, hitting 100 degrees in October. And this last one, at least 3 dead, thousands without power after historic snowstorm in North Carolina. So I've highlighted the word historic here because we're seeing that word in many of our weather headlines these days. Historic snowstorm, historic flooding, historic drought, historic storms. A lot of these words that tell us these are events that don't usually happen, yet they seem to be happening often. We're having these floods that are supposed to happen every 100 years, happening every 5 years, or maybe even every year. So the question is, are all these weather events that have happened over the past several years or decade or so actually historic? Are they actually extreme weather events? And the answer is yes, extreme weather is on the rise. And to clarify, by extreme weather, I mean floods, storms, droughts, and some other forms of extreme weather. You can see in the graph here that extreme weather has been on the rise for quite a few decades now, starting around the 1970s. And so there's some debate as to extreme weather, extreme heat, whether it's just natural variability. Maybe that's just the climate changes naturally over time. But we're at a point where science has shown us that these changes in the climate cannot be explained by natural variability alone. Humans have indeed had an influence on our climate, which in turn impacts our weather. And just as a quick review, I know all of you probably know this, but how greenhouse gases and climate change works. Just a reminder that climate change is driven by greenhouse gases that are trapped in the Earth's atmosphere, thus warming the Earth, leading to changing climate and extreme weather patterns, as I mentioned. So just a reminder of the process here. So the big picture, what we're seeing is that climate change contributes to increases in the severity, the frequency, and the duration of extreme weather events. So when extreme weather events do happen nowadays, they are more severe than they used to be. They're happening more often than they used to, and they are lasting longer. So, what's driving climate change and this increase in extreme weather events? And we know for a fact that climate change is largely driven by emissions from the transportation sector. In the United States, the transportation sector is the #1 contributor to greenhouse gases. So you can see in the graph here, the transportation sector, about 29%, electricity follows closely at 28%. And the vast majority of those greenhouse gas emissions come from driving. So if you look at this figure on the right, you can see that trains, planes, ships, and other forms of transportation are absolutely part of the issue and are absolutely emitting greenhouse gases. But again, driving, those passenger vehicles and trucks, vast majority of the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is from the images from a New York Times article. The data is from the EPA. And so in North Carolina, we see a similar situation. Not exactly the same, but similar. In North Carolina, as of this data in 2017, transportation is the #2 source of greenhouse gas emissions. That's pretty close to electricity, which is at 35%. As of now in 2020, those numbers are probably a little closer, and transportation may very likely be the #1 greenhouse gas emission source. So these greenhouse gases from the transportation sector are driving the changes to our atmosphere. We've established that, which thus contributes to climate change, which causes these superstorms and other extreme weather events. And ironically, the transportation sector is then having to spend a large portion of its budget on storm repairs when the roads are ripped up or other issues come about from extreme weather events. So this is North Carolina Department of Transportation average annual storm costs. So we look at the average annual storm cost in the period from 2014 to 2016, and then look at the storm costs in the period from 2017 to present. And I will clarify, by present, I got this data in 2019. So you can think of that as 2017 to 2019. And it doesn't take too much mental math to figure out that those costs over tripled between 2014 to 2016 and 2017 to 2019. Huge costs for storm repairs, especially hurricanes, hurricane damage for NCDOT in that latter period. So transportation sector is emitting all these greenhouse gases. So we have to figure out what's our solution to lower the amount of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the transportation sector. And there are a number of different solutions for cleaning up the transportation sector, and we could talk about a lot of them. But the one I'm going to focus on today, which you've probably already guessed, is greenways. Greenways are sometimes called by other terms multi-use paths, a shared use path, trails, walking and biking paths, etc. No matter what you call it, greenways are a critical piece of the clean transportation solution. And I will say, just to note, that while I'm focusing just on greenways in this presentation, that shouldn't downplay the other forms of clean transportation or low emission transportation, all of which need to go hand in hand with greenways. So just keep that in mind as I'm going through, that greenways are one solution among many solutions that should go hand in hand together. And just to touch on this idea before I really delve into it, to remember that greenways are not just transportation, they're the intersection of transportation, recreation, and conservation. They provide people a place to exercise and get outside. That's the recreation piece. They are part of conservation. They really encourage us to preserve natural areas for trail use and not just for development. And of course, they are transportation. They're a way to get around, they're a way to commute, to get from point A to point B. And I love this Venn diagram. It came from the New Jersey Greenways guidebook, which I'm happy to share if anyone would like to see the source. And so I can't really talk about Greenways without using one as an example, the East Coast Greenway. And most of you know, but for those of you who don't, the East Coast Greenway is a walking and biking route that stretches 3,000 miles from Maine to Florida. And our mission is to connect all the different population centers along that Maine to Florida corridor. So we purposely are routed through the highest population areas and also through rural areas as well. As of 2019, we reached almost 1,000 miles of traffic protected greenway, and the route is 3,000 miles long approximately, so we are about 1/3 complete. Quick review of the numbers. Like I said, 3,000 miles long, passed through 15 states and Washington, D.C., passed through 450 different communities, and there are 25 million people within 5 miles of the route. And I want to focus on that last number, that 25 million people. So that's the number of people who are living within 5 miles of the route, but that doesn't mean that all of those 25 million people use the Greenway or even know about the Greenway. So one of our goals is to engage those people who aren't using the Greenway to start using it however best fits their needs, to have these people see the Greenway not just as a park or a place to recreate, but as an actual form of transportation. So one example I'll delve further into is a report that we had commissioned a few years ago, a Triangle Impact Report. This was a report that we had was produced by Alta Planning and Design with some data from NC State University and a couple other sources. And this study looked at how the East Coast Greenway benefits the health and economy of North Carolina's Triangle region. And when I say the Triangle, for those of you who aren't in North Carolina, the area the East Coast Greenway passes through within the Triangle is generally Raleigh, Cary, and Durham. So that's what I mean when I say Triangle. So to conduct this study, they did a combination of in-person surveys that were done on the trail and then analysis of past studies and extrapolating that data. But what I really want to highlight from this study is the transportation and environmental benefits that the consultants found when they really looked into the data. So starting with transportation and access benefits, we found that there are about, due to the presence of the East Coast Greenway in the Triangle, about 1.4 million fewer miles traveled by car each year, which results in, I won't go through each of these numbers, but reductions in household vehicle costs, reductions in collision-related costs, and reductions in congestion-related costs. And we all know when we're talking to leaders that everyone likes to see these monetary numbers. So these are great results for us to have as a case study. And then, of course, the health and environmental benefits. Due to the presence of the East Coast Greenway in the Triangle, there are over 11 million miles biked per year, over 7 million miles walked per year, which adds up to around 3.5 million hours of physical activity each year. That is a lot of exercise, which results in healthcare cost savings. And to clarify healthcare cost savings here, we mean money saved that would have gone towards preventable diseases, maybe such as diabetes or heart disease, healthy weight management, etc. And then the big number I want to focus on here is this annual reduction in CO2 emissions at the bottom. So it's 1.1 million pounds of reduction in CO2 emissions. And keep in mind that's just for the Triangle. That's just for that Durham, Cary, Raleigh area of the East Coast Greenway. So think about what that might be if this were applied to a larger area along a longer stretch of the Greenway. And just a quick note that this report is available online. If you go to our website, greenway.org, and go to the North Carolina State page, you can download it for free. So we've looked at some of the data. We can see that the East Coast Greenway is a great benefit to the Triangle region, and we've seen that there is indeed a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But going back to the big picture, why are greenways one of the key parts of the clean transportation solution? Why aren't they a bigger part of the clean transportation solution? Why don't more people know about them? So I'd like to now go into a few of the specifics why greenways are a great solution as forms of clean transportation. First of all, greenways are resilient. They can handle flooding, for example. It's a lot more okay if the greenway floods than if a housing complex or a business complex, for example, floods. Flooding and sea level rise will both become more common as climate change continues. There will be less and less land where we can build houses and businesses, and there will be more land where houses once were that can now operate as greenway corridors. There are many places, including segments along the East Coast Greenway, where greenway segments were built on FEMA buyout properties, so areas where houses once were that were flooded, damaged so extensively they weren't going to be rebuilt. And so greenways, other trails were able to be built in those areas. And I will address the obvious point that when a greenway is flooded, it's not a totally reliable form of transportation. That's really not ideal to bike on, for example. But that's why we advocate for greenways that go hand in hand with other forms of sustainable transportation, like buses, trains, metro connections, etc. And secondly, answering the question, why greenways? Greenways can be part of the climate change solution. They can be part of climate change legislation. This photo is from the signing of Executive Order 80 in North Carolina. This was back in October of 2018, I believe. And so Executive Order 80 is a commitment to address climate change and transition to a clean energy economy. And there's three main directives that are part of Executive Order 80. The first is reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions. The second is increase the number of zero emission vehicles. And the third is reduce energy consumption in state buildings. So this is a great effort, but one thing that is missing that could play a huge role in fulfilling that first goal, reducing statewide greenhouse gas emissions, is greenways, is to plan and build more greenways for people to use. When greenways are built in the right places, they can absolutely be used for commuting. As many of us know, commuting in single occupancy vehicles is what causes so many of our greenhouse gas emissions, as we saw from the data earlier. So imagine if we could move commuters off the road, out of their cars, and onto the greenway. Imagine the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if we could move even 10, 15% of people who are in those single occupancy vehicles off the road and onto the greenway. So what we really have here is an opportunity. We have an opportunity to do with petroleum what we did with coal. So you can see on the graph here that black line is coal consumption in the United States. And you can see it really dropped precipitously. So in the United States, our consumption of coal peaked around 2005, but since then it's declined over 40%. Petroleum has been the largest source of energy in the United States since around the 1950s, and you can see it's still rising. And we have an opportunity to really decrease our reliance on petroleum. I'm not saying get rid of it completely. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's going to happen in the United States in particular. But we can decrease our reliance on a substance that does emit so many different greenhouse gases and other toxic substances into our atmosphere. So before we continue talking about how great greenways are and how everyone should have a greenway in their community, it is important to address the barriers to using greenways. So obviously greenways are not the main form of transportation in North Carolina or in the United States right now. And it's worth talking about why they're not and why people aren't using greenways when they are available. So there's a lot of different reasons, but the main three I'll go into are listed here. So bike and pedestrian infrastructure needs to be safe, connected, and convenient. And I'd like to go through the three of those in a bit more detail, starting with safety. And before I forget, this figure is also from the Triangle Impact Report that I mentioned earlier. Again, you can access that online, or I'm happy to send it to you. So the bad news is there are an average of 193 bicyclists and pedestrians killed each year in North Carolina. The good news is that shared use paths, like the East Coast Greenway, reduce those injury rates and fatality rates by about 60% compared with on-street facilities. So when greenways are there, it makes it a lot safer for everyone who's using them, as compared to, for example, a simple unprotected bike lane that might be on street. The second piece is connectivity. Bike and pedestrian infrastructure and greenways need to connect people to the places they need to go. So this is a graph I took out of a League of American Bicyclists report. And you can see that it's percent of all trips by walking or biking. But first I want to draw your attention to the x-axis. Don't be fooled and think that that goes up to 100%. That only goes up to 14%. So you can see that over time, at least walking rates do seem to be increasing. But again, the max rate on there is in 2017, 12% of all trips are by walking. It's much less by biking. And this is data that goes hand in hand with some 2010 data from the National Household Travel Survey, which I wrote down here, which I also thought was important to mention, that of all biking trips, 59% are less than or equal to a mile, and of all walking trips, 87% are less than or equal to 1 mile. And to narrow down a bit on North Carolina, we can see here, North Carolina, percent of commuters who bike, 0.22%. Yikes. And a decrease between 2006, 2017, and 2011, 2017. This is also from a League of American Bicyclists report. So I will say that North Carolina is somewhat low on the list of out of states with high bike commuter rates. But even the states that have really high bike commuter rates, those rates are only up around 11, 12-ish%. So the data we're seeing shows that very, very few people are using biking and walking as primary modes of transportation. And so that really brings up the point again about connectivity. Greenways need to get people to where they need to go, or if people can't really bike or walk to where they need to go, it needs to connect them to another form of transportation. This is a photo I love from Northern Virginia of a bike rack connected to one of the metro stations. And you can see there's a roof there protecting the bikes. There's an escalator. There's also an elevator nearby. It makes it easy to do both short and long distance trips. And of course, I have to mention, connectivity is the whole mission of the East Coast Greenway, creating that connected corridor that stretches from Maine to Florida. So the last piece is convenience. As we're saying before, greenways need to connect the places where people live and where they go for resources. So there's many greenways that are out in the middle of the woods in rural areas, which are wonderful and important and should continue to be used. But greenways really need to connect to where people live to make it convenient for them to get around. We have to make it easy for people to use a greenway. Plenty of people, myself included, are guilty of loading up their bikes on the back of their car and then driving to a greenway access point. I've certainly done it before. But what we need to do, and what's really important, is that we make it so that people can get to the greenway from their house without having to load up their bike on a car or drive to a parking lot just to walk in a safe, protected area. And this is another figure from the Triangle Impact Report, which really just drives home the point that we have to make it easier to get on your bike or walk versus getting your car. The good news is, as you can see here, financially, it's more convenient to operate a bike than a car. The average cost of operating a bike from this report is listed at $308 per year. I'd argue even less depending on what kind of bike you have, whereas the average cost of operating a car is a little over $8,000 per year. So these numbers are great and they make it obvious that having a bike is cheaper, but especially for folks who do have disposable income, it's often still easier and more convenient to get in the car to go somewhere. And so what we need to do with Greenways is make it just as convenient, if not more convenient, to get on a bike or get on your feet and start walking to get where you need to go. Which brings us back to the beginning. The point that if greenways are going to be convenient, they also have to be safe and connected. So it's the big three here: safety, connectivity, and convenience. Once we make greenways safe, connected, and convenient, we can get more people using them. And when more people are using greenways, along with other forms of clean transportation, instead of motorized transportation, we can take the numbers like the one listed at the bottom here, that 1.1 million pounds reduction in CO2 emissions, and we can increase those numbers tenfold, 20-fold, 100-fold when we apply these solutions larger scale. And that's when we can really make an impact in combating climate change, when we have greenways that are longer distances that connect even more communities and get people where they need to go so they don't have to get in their car and they can walk or bike or use whatever form of non-motorized transportation works for them. And before I wrap up, I just want to end on this image, reminding us that greenways are not just transportation or just recreation or just conservation, but the intersection of all three. And in our efforts to create a clean transportation future, we need to think about greenways in this intersectional way. And with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you again for being here and for listening. I hope this was enjoyable or at least somewhat interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. You can email me, sarah@greenway.org. Or if you want to be on social media and you have Twitter, my Twitter handle is @Sarah_D_Sanford. Feel free to interact on there. And again, thank you to everybody for being part of our first ever virtual Southeast Greenways and Trail Summit. We really appreciate you being here and we appreciate your support of the East Coast Greenway.